In the time of the Reagan administration, El Salvador was run by a military junta. And the Reagan administration gave aid to this junta continuously, till its very end. This was despite the fact that it was a well-known fact across all media agencies that reported about it continuously. Where was this money going to? It was going particularly and specifically to the hiring, training, and recruitment of death squads that traversed the nation and shot and killed political activists and people who supported the right. That's the kind of way third world debt with regards to nations recovering from dictatorial regimes has manifested, and that's morally reprehensible, something we cannot tolerate. We would cancel it. Who are these nations recovering from dictatorial regimes? Well, they are nations who were once governed by dictators, and these dictatorships were typically set up during a time of the Cold War, where both superpowers actively strove to prop up these governments that would be supportive to them at whatever cost, regardless of whatever they were doing, so long as they continued trading with the US was fine with it, so long as they continued trading with the Soviet Union was fine with it. Now, their collapse recently has brought about a rise of democratic institutions that have led to progress, but that doesn't mean that they are still recovering from these dictatorial regimes, meaning that the effects of that regime still manifest in that nation. We're talking about widespread poverty across the nation because these dictatorships use the money not to fuel their own growth, but to fuel their lavish lifestyles. We're talking about social inequalities precisely because these dictatorships created repressive policies that created social inequalities. And we think that's unacceptable. We're going to cancel the debt because we think that's what's fairest. I'll take Darren in a moment, because that's what's fairest and thus what's best for the people. Yes, Darren?
Are you against the First World giving all loans to dictatorships or not?
Giving all loans to dictatorships? Well, we don't think First World nations should continue giving debts to these dictatorial regimes because they abuse it, because they don't do anything, because they can't be trusted with this money. But we're talking fundamentally about nations that have recovered from these dictatorial regimes, that are now on the progress towards democracy. What do we do about them? Do we treat them fairly? And we say yes. So we're going to cancel the loans taken on during the period that these regimes were in power, and they would have no obligation to continue paying. In addition, we demand that these creditors would compensate for the amount that has been paid already, because we think they had no obligation to pay that amount. In addition, we'd like to clarify that this is a one-time only offer, meaning that this debt is going to be cancelled now, but since you're a democracy now, you have certain expectations placed upon you. We're no longer going to cancel your debt. This is the only time it's going to be done. In addition, we will stop giving loans to dictatorial regimes that continue existing. Now, an example of where this occurred was Haiti, where following its democratization after the fall of the Duvalier father-son regime, what happened was that the US creditors as well as French creditors both cancelled the debt, and we saw thus an increase in the ability to maintain order and create growth in that society. So today I'll be talking about the creditor's obligation, while my second speaker will be talking about antagonizing and alienating these new democratically elected nations. So now let's talk about the creditor's obligation. I'll be proving two things. First of all, these nations have no legal obligation to pay, and secondly, we have a moral obligation to cancel the debt. Let's first talk about this legal obligation. Now we need to understand that all loans, even the kind of loan that we go to the bank to take out, is taken on the assumption and on the prerequisite condition that both parties, the creditor and the person taking on the debt, has agreed to it. And therefore, that's why democratically elected governments, though they change, inherit each other's debt. The debt taken on by one democratically elected government becomes national debt, because it's acknowledged that all of these democratically elected regimes are the legal representative of the legal personality that is the nation. And we think that dictators don't act as a legal representative for their nation, and consequently cannot be said to represent the finances and wishes and desires of the people in the taking on of these loans. This is because, simply put, they weren't elected. majority of them enter through military coups, some of them enter through plainly abolishing the constitution and declaring them supreme ruler of that state. They weren't elected, they weren't representative, and therefore it makes it unfair to make a nation that is now represented by a legal, legitimate representative to pay a debt that was no part of their desires, that was no part of what the people wanted. And so I've shown you how we have no guarantee that this was the people's desire. This was ultimately a decision taken on by one man. We cannot make them pay it. No thank you. Now let's talk about the more pressing thing, the moral obligation. And the reason we need to forgive third world debt is because to continue expecting nations to pay it is just wrong. What was this debt used for? Well, it was used by these dictatorships who had no checks on their powers, who had no incentive to benefit the people. And so they didn't. What they did was they continued establishing control on their regime. They continued oppressing the people in a momentary. They continued shooting their people down. Yes, sir.
Do you recognize the sovereignty of dictatorships?
So no, we don't think that these dictatorships are sovereign leaders of these governments. But what we do recognize is that we cannot violate the sovereignty of that nation in totality willy-nilly. And this is because invasions and any kind of interference in a nation's internal politics has dramatic repercussions that aren't always for the interest of that state. Therefore, we don't recognize their sovereignty. We continue to actively engage them and try and deal with them, but we cannot invade, we cannot do that kind of thing. So, what did these dictatorships do? These dictatorships violently oppressed their people. General Anastasio de Bail of Nicaragua used the money to actively fund the repression of his people. He used it to shoot people down on sight if they started protesting in front of his gate. He used that money to discriminate against the certain regions within Nicaragua. General Fujimori in Peru was no different. What he did with that money was spend 50 million of an entire debt loan taken out by the US government to build an excessive palace complex in the Peruvian mountains. All this in the midst of a famine that the Peruvian people were suffering from. He went full and fat, and they starved to death. And the thing is that these governments that gave out these loans were fully complicit in this. And sometimes they actively encouraged the repression because they thought that would serve their interests. At other times, they didn't care about this repression. Why? Because sometimes it served their interest to let this repression continue. Sometimes it ensured order. Sometimes it ensured that these governments maintained their favorable status to you. Sometimes it meant that these governments they would reap massive amounts of profit. And because we were complicit in that oppression, we don't think it's moral for us to extend the oppression today, where the people continue suffering the direct impact of this poverty incurred, the direct impacts of this repression. The only way out for them is growth, but we can't create growth if they continue having to pay these debts, because these debts are so crippling to these people. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot cripple their future. We cannot blame them for a past that they weren't part of. Go with team proposition.
We agree that new regimes need support from the international community, but this help must be fair for both taxpayers of lender nations and for the people in the third world, and must benefit the third world, or must benefit these new regimes in the long run. So what's our stance on the South opposition? We are against debt cancellation in principle, but our solution to the problems raised by proposition is to postpone the debt or remove the interest on debt, such that these loans become feasibly repayable for these new regimes. What do you mean by this? We will postpone the repayment of debt until the country's economic recovery has taken place. So debt will be paid in installments, and the size of the installments will be tied to the socio-economic conditions of the country. And these indicators of these socio-economic conditions include the GDP per capita of the country or the Human Development Index of the country. our side of the house is non-mutually exclusive, with aid and grants given to these new regimes in order to support their economic recovery. We give you an example of this postponement of debt. Germany took 80 years to repay its World War I reparations, but the principle that we are standing for is that it repaid its debt eventually, even if it took 8 decades to do so, and that's the principle we are standing for on the side of opposition. So let's move on to deal with their case on 2 grounds. First, they came out and told us there's no legal obligation for these nations to repay the debt, and then they told us that we have a moral obligation as lender nations to cancel this debt. Firstly, whether there's a legal obligation. We tell that just because a dictatorial regime has been overthrown doesn't mean that no part of the regime remains at all within the country. For example, in Egypt, where Hosni Mubarak, a dictator, was overthrown, Hosni Mubarak's position as a dictator would not be possible without the support of the powerful Egyptian military. And we see the powerful Egyptian military continuing to play an active role in Egyptian politics today. So because parts of the regime still remain, we don't think it's fair for them to characterize a dictatorial regime as being completely different from the new democratic regime that's set up within these countries. But more importantly, we ask them a very simple question, which is whether we recognize the sovereignty of these dictatorships, whether we recognize the leaders of these, or whether we recognize the dictators and leaders of these nations as legitimate representatives of their people. And we say yes, we do in the status quo. And precisely because we do in the status quo, there's no reason for us to cancel that because, on the basis that these regimes are not representative of the people. Firstly, the international community allows these dictators to make decisions on behalf of their people. We respect when we respect the decision of these dictators when these dictators sign trade deals with our countries, for example. We also recognize the position of these leaders as presidents and dictators of their country because we engage with these dictatorships, because we open embassies in these dictatorships, because we acknowledge them as legitimate leaders of their country. Sure, it's not ideal for a country to have a dictatorship, but what we must recognize is that these leaders, even though they may not be the most ideal leaders, are still the leaders of their country, and there's no reason why we should cancel that simply because a better government has taken place. What they've told us was that these dictators took out loans that were essentially self-serving. We told you on the contrary that these leaders took out loans on behalf of their country. Even if this wasn't the best interest of their people, the logical extension of their policy would then be to cancel all loans or cancel all debts that were not taken in the self-interest of their country, meaning that they'll cancel the debts of incompetent governments. And we say that's a slippery slope that we cannot afford to take on our side of the house. Yes.
So we were very clear about this. If they were incompetent but elected, that means that incompetence reflects that nation.
Sir, your principle was that these leaders were not acting in the best interest of their people. So following that principle, if these leaders failed to act in the best interest of the people because they're incompetent, you would cancel their debt too. So moving on to the second main point of contention, on the whole idea of the moral obligation. They told us firstly that these nations were complicit in the oppression of the people, but then completely neglecting the positive effects of loans in improving the quality of life of people. And I'm going to speak about this in my kind of substantive. The second thing it told us, no thank you sir, was that growth is necessary for these nations, and that growth can only take place if these nations don't have debt. We tell you very simply that repayment and postponement of debt until such time when the nation is ready to pay for this debt provides the necessary conditions for growth. But when a nation is economically powerful enough to repay this debt, we say by all means repay this debt, and that's the stance that we are taking in opposition. So as the first speaker, we're talking about why their policy is unfair to citizens of lender nations and hurt citizens of dictatorships in the long run. My second speaker, we're talking in the room. Hold on a moment, sir, about why this demeans new regime. Yes.
Explain to me why in the future Zimbabwe should repay the debt that is being used to finance the killing of
I'm going to tell you this in my point of substantive, but suffice to say, we think this is unfair for the citizens of lender nations. So our baseline for today is that we believe that what's right for new regimes must be balanced with what is actually good for these new regimes and what is right for lenders in the first world. So my first point is substantive about the principle of repayment and how cancelling loans is unfair and irresponsible to citizens of lender nations. We first established that the government is accountable to its taxpayers, and when lender governments make loans to dictatorships, this was done with the implicit condition that the loans will be repaid. And this is why citizens of lender nations consented to these loans in the first place, because they believe that these loans will eventually be repaid. And we tell that the principle behind this is that the citizens have every right to decide how their money is being spent, because they are the taxpayers, they are the people who contributed to these government funds in the first place. But what happens on their side of the house is that the government is arbitrarily breaking this contract. Lender governments are arbitrarily breaking this contract because they suddenly decided that for reasons that are beyond the control of these citizens of lender nations, these citizens won't get their money back. And we say it's unfair to these citizens of lender nations because their money is not being repaid because of a reason that's completely beyond their control, and that is the overthrow of a dictatorial regime. So we think that fundamentally, their side of the house is unfair to taxpayers of lender nations. But now we're moving on to tell you about the new regimes in the first place, and how this discourages first world nations from loaning to dictatorships. No, thank you. Firstly, we recognize that loans do benefit the people. And here's where we disagree with what Rohan said. Because many loans have strict conditions tied to them to ensure that governmental abuse of this money isn't going to happen. Right? The first one isn't so stupid as to give dictatorial regimes blank checks in order to massacre their people. And in fact, the IMF and World Bank imposed many loans, such as infrastructural loans specifically for the building of infrastructure, and all these benefited the people because it gave the government cash to do what's good for the people. And even if loans were used to prop up dictatorships, we say that the alternative isn't much worse, because if loans were used to build a $50 million palace, if no loans were given to build a $50 million palace, the dictator would extract $50 million worth of wealth from his people in order to build a palace, making life miserable for his people, because the dictator would then squeeze the people in order to prop up his regime. So how does their policy discourage first world nations from providing these essential loans to dictatorships? Firstly, we recognize that that the reason why countries choose to give aid in the form of loans and not direct grants is to get their money back, because governments have to be accountable to their people, and governments have finite budgets, right? Secondly, the second reason why governments choose to give aid in the form of loans and not just grants is because aid budgets are finite. And if you give money in the form of loans, you can help a lot more countries, a lot more developing countries, because then you are making better use of money instead of giving money straight away to dictatorships. But what their side of the house does is that when first world nations recognize that dictators are unstable, especially due to the recent Arab Spring, where we saw many dictatorial regimes being overthrown, they recognize that their loans will not be paid back, and this disincentivizes them from giving these crucial loans that are necessary for the citizens of dictatorships to these people in the first place. And that's why we stand on the side of opposition.
We think it's funny today that they actually believe that the rights of someone in the first world to have the loan money back is more important than how these people who are just recovering from dictatorial regimes who have been suppressed for the past 10 or 20 years to have some ability to recover financially from the sort of oppression that they've been put under. We don't think that this is the moral thing to do, we don't think it's the right thing to do, we don't think it's the beneficial thing to do. And I'll talk about this in my 3 main points of contention today. First, is postponing loans enough? Secondly, do dictatorships represent and do what's good for the people? And the third, what are effects on lender nations? So first today, is postponing debt enough? Where they told us that, they're going to postpone it and everything's going to be okay. Which we don't think is going to be true, because what happens when you postpone that, in fact, it means that inflation is going to happen over years, meaning that the amount that you have to pay for the debt increases as money changes, as the value of money changes over the years, meaning that if anything, the amount of debt that you have to pay at the end of that period is going to increase. Second, there are also detriments in the short term. For example, the decrease in investor confidence, because they know in that country, because they know that the government owes some money that's going to have to pay it back eventually and isn't going to be able to fully develop it in its infrastructure. But thirdly, that it's still going to bring about a harm, like resentment, for example. They gave us the example of Germany, and we tell you what happened in Germany. Despite the fact that it was postponed, many Germans still called it a diktat. This withdrew them from the international community, withdrew the good effects that democracy was bringing about. And I'll talk about this in my substantive today. But lastly, that we think that even if you postpone it or if you pay it today, essentially it's something that's morally wrong to do, and we think that they have not engaged us on this point today. I'll talk about this in my other points of contention. Yes, sir.
The reason why it isn't morally wrong is because we can always make up for problems such as inflation in our policy, but the fundamental point is we do have a principal need to return the sum to the first world.
No, we don't think there's a principal need to return to the sum to the first world, because a lot of the guilt for even lending this money is one that rests on first world shoulders, and I'll talk about this in my contention later on. Secondly, do dictatorships represent the people? Where they said that, oh, they're legitimate because we recognize them in the international community. To which we have to argue that recognizing them in the international community is not something that we do because we principally believe that they are the representative of the people, but something that we're forced to do because the alternative means going into that country, means fighting with those dictators and losing more lives. And this is why it's okay for us to infringe on dictatorship's sovereignty by sanctioning them, for example, as we do with Myanmar, in order to change their policies, because we recognize that they fundamentally don't have the sort of sovereign right to make decisions for their people. Secondly, they gave us the example of how, you know what, they will do things that are in favor of their people, to which we say, this isn't true. Even if your loans came with conditions, many of these dictators circumvented them, simply didn't listen to them, and by then it was too late to get your money back. But more importantly, that many of these loans which were given were in fact a blank check, as we saw to Guinea, for example. And what this resulted in were these dictators using the money to oppress their people, using it to clamp down on communist descendants, for instance, because this was in fact what was in the first world interest. So third today, lender nations, where they told us that, you know what, these people deserve to have their money back, to which we say that they don't, because they lended this money out. We think that they're morally responsible because they knew in fact that these were dictatorial regimes, in fact these, in fact, and furthermore, they knew what they were going to do with their money. Rohan gave you the context that many times during the Cold War, they lended it out to dictatorial regimes because doing so ensured that there would be some form of stability when they crushed communist descendants, thereby ensuring that, you know, the Soviet threat wasn't so much anymore. And we do think that they were also morally responsible for that. So today I'm going to talk about alienating newly democratic governments. But I'll first talk about the challenges that they face due to debt. Secondly, why not cancelling debts alienates them. And thirdly, on the effects of alienation. First today, what are the challenges that we face due to debt? And essentially, it's very expensive to build a democracy. Not only because of economic challenges, like Rohan told you about, but also because the democratic infrastructure entails building a lot of new things, like keeping corruption low, like building up new courts and training your judges, building up a new police force, as we see happening in Afghanistan. What that means is that billions of dollars go to paying the debt instead of going to building democratic infrastructures, as we saw happen in Mozambique, where in fact the value of their debt increased 12 times over the years, in fact, where high interest rates means that it often can't go towards development and investment, and people can't feel the effect of this money because they're paying that. This essentially hinders their ability to recover. Yes, sir?
Is your side against developmental loans? Answer this question.
We are not. If it is to a dictatorial regime, then we are against developmental loans because we do in fact think that they don't deserve this much money. Second today, why does not cancelling debts alienate them? And we think it works on two levels. The first being on the governmental level, where they resent the West for making them carry the burdens of the very dictator that they fought so hard to oust. And we saw this happen in the example that they gave us, for example, in Germany, where a lot of resentment remained against the international community as a result of the debt, regardless of the fact that it was postponed. Especially since in many of these circumstances, it was the West who encouraged this change to democracy, as we saw happening in Egypt. And therefore, when they see that the international community is not recognizing that they are fundamentally different governments with different interests, with different aims in that country, that they are not a continuation of the dictatorship, but a new government altogether, this is going to create a sense of betrayal in their governments, because they see their ability to develop, to move on, being viscerally hindered as a result of these debts. And this means that they aren't going to cooperate with the international community. They're going to be less willing to work with you. But secondly, that also affects the people. Because how do people on the ground react? People want to see real, substantial results. And the thing is that it doesn't matter if you've transited over to a democracy, if you're still suffering the same sort of economic problems that you were suffering in a dictatorship. And this means that because people are still suffering, they aren't going to support this newly democratic government, as we see happening in Niger, where they turned into a democracy in 1999, but their GDP stayed constant in the 11 years ever since. And as a result, we see very little support for the democratic government in power. Third today, what are the effects of alienation? We think they affect them both locally and regionally. on a local level, we are no longer able to guide their movement towards democracy because they're alienated from us, they don't want to work with us. And we think that this is extremely vital in building a democracy, as we see in Afghanistan, where NATO officials are stationed in every province, because that is simply the sort of work that you need in order to ensure that a democratic government can come into power successfully. But secondly, on a regional level, that these democracies, which could have been influential in leading movements towards democracies, now no longer are, because the incentives for other countries in the region to turn into democracies are hindered when they see that democracies face the same economic problems, are in the same pitfalls, and essentially are no different from the dictatorial regimes before that. And this creates less of an incentive for other countries to work towards democracy, to work towards liberating their people, and we don't think that we'll be able to see the results that we saw in South Africa, for example, where upon them turning into democracy, Mali followed soon after, the same sort of democratic movements we see in the Arab Spring. We don't think they're going to be brought about, and we would therefore cancel the debts of nations who have previously been under dictatorial regimes.
Rohan said their side supports not giving loans to countries which are run by dictators. Americans back this up saying, yep, they're all against loans, even developmental loans, because these loans only go to supporting dictatorial regimes. The big question which they haven't answered, which Glennon asked was, do the people in the third world actually need these developmental loans? And that's the first question I'll ask. Are loans a good thing for dictatorial regimes? Because this actually forms the foundation for a lot of the arguments which both sides are running. The second question I have is whether there's principal need to cancel debt, and the third, whether there's practical benefit or practical harm in the cancellation of debt. So first of all, in the first place, are loans a good thing for dictatorial regimes? They said loans are a blank check. Look at the Cold War. Aside from the fact that the Cold War was a really long time ago, the fact is, today, monetary institutions are clever enough not to give you blank checks. That's why loans come with conditions. That's why the first world nations no longer just give you cash and let you spend it however you want, because these nations recognize that this cash isn't going to go anywhere useful. Therefore, everything which Glendon said, which America conveniently ignored about how first world nations, thank you sir, don't actually give blank checks to the third world anymore, is a reason why, in fact, these loans don't just fund the pockets of these regimes. We've learned from our mistakes of the past. We don't give them blank checks anymore. But in fact, more of Glendon's analysis was neglected by their second speaker. Glendon told you how, even if it were just giving you money, this money is a good thing, because it means that these regimes don't squeeze their people for this money in the first place, which is a bad thing for the information of side proposition. They neglected Glendon's analysis about how, at the very least, even if our loans are taken away, no thank you, this prevents the government from taking this same quantity away from their people, allowing the people to lead slightly better lives, and that's what side opposition is looking out for. So in the first place, loans are a really good thing for the developing world. No thank you, because they keep infrastructure building and they keep people alive. Second contention, do we have a principled need to cancel debt? And really, the root of all of their moral analysis comes from the idea that, debts are crippling. So let's address this whole question. Can we stop debts from being crippling? No thank you. They said inflation happens. Well, then adjust for it. The fact of the matter is, the only time in which inflation actually affects the amount of debt you have to pay is when you pay in a different currency. So use debt restructuring to prevent this from happening. Adjust for inflation rates. There are all sorts of ways we can prevent the quantity, the principal sum you have to repay from increasing. Therefore, our side can actually postpone debt and prevent some kind of greater amount from happening. So for this reason, no, debts aren't crippling, no thank you, because we can actually make up for this crippling effect which they speak of. Then they said that then they talked about the moral need, because dictators are representative of people, but they're actually forced to recognize them. Well, no, they are not forced to recognize dictators. Don't open embassies in these dictators' countries. That's a simple thing which Glendon talked about, which they claim is they are somehow forced to do. Don't include them in the United Nations. So just talk to them as people. The fact is, under side proposition's paradigm, they are at the same time recognizing dictatorships and at the same time pretending that these dictatorships don't have a moral representation of their people. That's a tension which I challenge this speaker to respond to now.
So when you restructure debts, your lenders are going to get less money. How then are you fulfilling the taxpayers' obligation that your
Our point is that a principal sum has to be paid. Alright, fine. Maybe we're decreasing the sum by some quantity, but the fact of the matter is your side is decreasing it to zero, and we think that the taxpayers in the first world would much rather have some rather than none, because that sum isn't going to be much different from what it was originally anyway. So moving back to my contention, let's talk about the third contention here, in which I'll address America's point on substantive. She said that we're alienating government because look at Germany. Germany hated the fact it had to pay back its debt over 80 years. Not true. Germany consistently voted in governments that continued to repay these, this debt which it owed, which was incidentally a war debt, not actually not actually debt from the First World. No, thank you. For this reason, like, if they claim that democracies are representative of their people, then they must also accept that the German government was representing its people's wishes when it paid this debt back. For this reason, we think it's perfectly acceptable for these countries to pay their debt back. They don't actually dislike it. But then she said that these countries now have no incentive to turn into democracies. Absolutely untrue. The incentive to liberate yourself doesn't just come from the incentive to not have to pay for the crimes of your previous regime. The incentive is to be free. It's as simple as that. So don't let side proposition argue that now countries aren't going to become democratic because suddenly they have to pay debt.
Sir?
No, the price of freedom is much higher than that. Yes, sir.
So, if you had to pay the Japanese occupiers in World War II who killed your ancestors, would you be happy about that?
Well, yes, but unfortunately the First World lenders who gave me a house were not the Japanese soldiers who murdered my ancestors. So no, that's a completely false analogy. Moving on to my substantive analysis, I've got two. The first point is about how it provides a perverse incentive for lenders to entrench dictatorial regimes. My second substantive is about demeaning new regimes. So first substantive argument, how it provides a perverse incentive for lenders to entrench regimes. Now let's understand the status quo. In the status quo, nations like China, which is incidentally the largest lender to the developing world, don't actually care about the rise and fall of dictatorships. What they really care about is whether their money comes back to them. So here's the big problem with side proposition. They provide a perverse incentive, no thank you, for these countries to keep dictatorships alive so that these dictatorships can continue to repay them their loans, which are incidentally in large quantities. This is very important. Firstly, China has the capability to keep dictatorships alive. It has this capability because it can fund dictatorships directly to cash, and it can fund, no thank you, and it can provide weapons to dictatorships. We saw it do this in Sudan not too long ago. For this reason, we think that China is perfectly capable of keeping dictatorships alive, but more importantly, the second key thing to recognize about China is its willingness to keep dictatorships alive. China's foreign policy is fundamentally inclined towards a pragmatic approach, and if pragmatically speaking, it requires its money to come back to it because it's lending out huge sums to the third world, then pragmatically it's going to adopt the approach, which we think is a consequence of their policy. So the problem with their policy is that it offers nations which incidentally can use such mechanisms as the UN, as its veto on the UNSC to prevent international action against dictatorships. It gives these nations a perverse incentive to keep these dictatorships alive. They are fully capable of doing so, they will do so. Side proposition had better tell us how they plan to deal with dictatorships now that big countries are sustaining them. Second substantive argument about how it demeans new regimes. No thank you. So here we have to understand the manner in which Western nations treat new regimes. The power relation which is established between a Western nation and a rising democracy is always one of a donor-recipient model. The idea here is that the Western superiority complex drives foreign policy relations, and we don't think this is a good thing. It's not a good thing because we want new democracies to be respected as equal members of the international community. And one key tenet of this respect is responsibility. Sure, your government has changed, but the one thing which doesn't change, no thank you, is the fact that you as a citizenry remain. And importantly, notice that my first speaker's analysis about how institutions tend to carry over from previous regimes to the new regimes wasn't responded to by their side either, which is another reason, incidentally, why the moral impetus they speak of doesn't hold. But the important thing here is that when these institutions remain, they have to be treated with the respect due to another sovereign entity. Otherwise, this respect isn't granted to new regimes. So here we argue that debt cancellation fits precisely into this donor-recipient model. Because you're essentially saying, as a new regime, you don't have the economic support to pay back your loans. You don't have the moral responsibility to do so, therefore will cancel your debt. The problem with this is that it doesn't treat these regimes as equal players, as sovereign entities. And that's why we think their model entrenches this power relation between the West and rising powers. So for this reason, firstly, we've demonstrated that loans are actually a good thing, and their side takes these loans away because firstly, as my first speaker pointed out, which their second speaker never rebutted, countries now have less incentive to loan to these countries because they don't know that they're getting it back. We argued that secondly, the principal need to cancel debt doesn't hold because we can still postpone debt and keeping your economy functioning, and also because institutions that existed yesterday still exist today, and those are the institutions whose debt is being cancelled. And I challenge top 3 to deal with all these things which they haven't till now.
We live in Singapore. 65 years ago, we came under Japanese occupation who killed our people, repressed our rights, and took away fundamental rights of our ancestors these many years ago. And imagine that if today you were being expected to pay for the bills that these Japanese soldiers chalked up while they were busy butchering Singaporeans back in that era. We don't think it's morally acceptable for us to expect future generations to pay back loans that their dictators took to kill their own people. This is an idea that side opposition has conveniently glossed over the entire debate. We say it is the key idea why side opposition is proposing this motion, and it's an idea they have refused to engage us on. Let's look at the three main actors in today's debate. Firstly, post-dictatorial countries. Secondly, lender nations. And third, dictators today. Radio, the second speaker, Santos. Let's look at the first group of people today, post-dictatorial countries. And the first thing they tell us here is that, look, you know, loans no thank you, sir. It's that in these countries, formerly when the dictators, loans always worked on behalf of the people because they were conditional. And this is something I don't understand. Because the fact we're talking about loans that were made to these dictatorial countries before, this was in the era of the Cold War, something Rohan told you in first speaker. What happened in the Cold War was that countries like the United States, for instance, were interested in propping up dictatorships, no thank you, to curb the spread of Soviet influence and vice versa. That's why the Soviets sponsored Gambia, for instance, back in the Cold War. And because the interest was to sustain the dictatorial regimes, this means it was perfectly in donor countries' interest to impose no conditions so they could freely use the money to repress the people, to stay in power, and thereby not have the country turned over to the Soviets. That's why these loans were not conditional and were used to repress the people. Let's look at the other ideas, and they told us about how, you know, there are questions about the point. No, thank you, sir. And they tell us that today, look, donor countries have become more wise. They have become more wise because they stopped lending to dictators. Today, we lend to democratic institutions, no thank you, and countries who respect the will of their people. And that's why it's changed. No thank you. What else they tell us about? Sir, they told us, no, that in these countries, no thank you, we decrease the amount of loans going to them because somehow, you know, we stop. Because somehow some countries are afraid that they won't get their loans back to dictatorships today. And we perfectly agree, we stop giving them loans, which we are principally opposed to, and this is why in a minute. Instead, what we propose, no thank you, is a system of aid that goes to these countries. Aid does not need to be repaid by future generations to repay for the oppression of the dictators, and aid that helps the people. No thank you. So why then is it that, you know, that these post-dictatorial countries repay debt is so odious in our world? They seem to assert to us that that's because we say that they are in, you know, an economic hellhole in today's world, and we've never told you that was why. We told you that the reason why it was so bad to expect these dictatorial countries to repay the loans now was because in the past, this money was used to repress their people. This is something morally untenable, and we believe that to expect generations now, I'll take you in a minute, sir, to repay this debt is to ask them to pay for the deaths of their countrymen, the deaths created by the dictator whom they didn't even want in the first place. Yes?
China is virtually a dictatorship, and China would not have got to be what it is today without massive amounts of US economic loans and developmental aid. Deal with that.
China receiving US developmental aid. In the heights of the Cold War, China was aligned against the United States. Then to assert that China, you know, a communist country, was receiving massive aid from the international community is something we don't believe in. Let's look at what else they told us here. And the last thing they told us, no thank you, is that in response to my second speaker substantive, that these people don't actually oppose the repayment of this sort of odious debt. And this is not even something that we don't understand. This is very obvious to me in countries, for instance, like the Gambia, where there are constant calls for the country to just simply abrogate its debt, to default on this sort of odious debt. It is obvious that they don't want to repay the debt that was used to oppress them in the past. No thank you. Let's look at the second main group here, the question about lender nations. And here, side opposition that we consistently asserting to us, they have an obligation to be repaid. This obligation is inviolate and it's something that can never be sacrificed upon. Then in the second speaker, they came out here and conceded to us that yes, because of things like inflation, for instance, like cancelling the interest rates, the money they receive decreases by some quantity. Is it really an inviolate right for them to be repaid? Must they be repaid to today's world? They already tell us no. And we tell you that on top of this, this right doesn't even exist in the first place. Why is it so? Because the sort of funds that they were giving up to dictatorial regimes was used for immoral purposes, unfair purposes, to repress human rights in today's world. There is no obligation, no thank you, for them to repay for this sort of money to be repaid to their country. More importantly, we also need to recognize that there is no obligation to be repaid from post-dictatorial regimes in particular. And this was about how, because dictators were not legally representative of the country, they were elected into power. As my first speaker said, this means they did not represent the nation. No, thank you. At the time at which they took out the loan. What does this mean for lender nations? This means that if they really want to be repaid, who should they be going after? They shouldn't be going after the nations, the people of these nations today. No, thank you. But they should be going after the dictators' cronies, for instance, or even the dictators' descendants. And this is our rebuttal to what they say about Egypt when they tell us that, look, cronies are still in power today who have benefited from loans that were made in the past. We say, sure, go after these cronies, freeze their bank accounts, and seize their assets, but don't expect the country to pay for Mubarak's oppression all these decades ago. No, thank you. We'll deal with the last group now, dictators today. And the first thing they say is that we keep them alive because China will now want to give them more money in order to see that they don't lose their funds. What sort of money are they giving them? Aid. Money that doesn't need to be repaid, money that just goes in one direction and never comes back. How realistic is this? In an attempt to recover and recoup their investments in dictatorial regimes, they're now giving money away freely to these countries. This doesn't make any sense at all, and this point clearly is not one that can be credited today. Yes, sir.
The quantity of investment which China has placed in terms of developmental loans is immense. It is far cheaper for them to ship a few guns to a regime than to forsake all of this money.
The majority of developmental loans that China gives today are to democratic nations because of how they, because of how they do recognize that they have an international community, but more importantly, they don't want to be engaging in a pyramid scheme where they give additional money to dictatorial nations in order to prop up the sum of money they gave in the past. This fundamentally doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. What else did they tell us about? They told us about how these dictators are sovereign entities and we need to respect newly formed dictatorships. And we believe this isn't the case at all. Dictatorships are undemocratic in today's world. They fail to respect the rights of the people when they seize power and don't hold elections. These nations are not sovereign. The only respect we afford them in the international community is a respect, one of practicality of the fact we have to engage them as leaders of their country, but we, at the end of the day, do not respect the fact that they are sovereign, and there is no point creating a facade of respect of sovereignty when it does not exist in the first place. They also failed to deal with Amnesty's entire substantive about alienating the African continent when she told you that because now they expect to repay odious debt, there is less of incentive for the country to push back against existing debaters and push for democracy. For these reasons, that repaying debt remains immoral to this day, go with side proposition.
Right from first speaker, it was quite clear that one underlying assumption of the proposition case was that it all comes down to one thing. It all comes down to the necessary assumption that these dictatorships in the past used these loans for evil, either to oppress their people directly or to use them for superfluous things that does not matter. It is from this point that they draw all the other points, such as there's no moral obligation to pay it back. Why? Because it was used to do nasty things against these people. There's no legal obligation to do it. Why? Because these dictatorships didn't care for these people, and therefore, legally speaking, sovereignty-wise, they aren't exactly in charge of these people. We find it quite amazing. The side proposition readily concedes all dictatorships in the world today, including China and Russia, all should not have their sovereignties respected. So, ladies and gentlemen, two main points of contention for the House today. First of all, how are loans taken out by dictatorships? Through understanding this process, by looking at why developing nations would give out such loans in the first place, and why dictatorships would even bother to accept such loans in the first place, we can understand this debate. Second main point of contention. So thank you, sir. How are such loans going to be repaid? So ladies and gentlemen, let's deal with their fundamental assumption now. How are loans taken out by dictatorships? So under here, we have two tiers, as stated earlier. So why would developed nations give out such loans in the first place? Right from first speaker all the way down the line, they characterize this as a Cold War debate. This is clearly not a Cold War debate. The Cold War was over so long ago. We believe that most dictatorships, if not all, have already been overthrown and replaced with the new ones. And what are the new ones here today? The new ones aren't in the Eastern European region, ladies and gentlemen. They are in Africa. They are in the Middle East. They are in these areas which are not influenced by the Cold War. But before that, let's deal with the Cold War first. First of all, the Marshall Plan wasn't purely loans, right? Most of it was aid. That's what made the Marshall Plan so attractive in the first place. The Marshall Plan gave out freely economic aid to these countries. Economic aid that doesn't have to be paid because it's economic and can't be squandered. Not only that,
So-
we pointed out to you how this is irrelevant and how the notion of dictatorships has clearly shifted. The notion of dictatorships in the world today is clearly rooted in the Middle East, in Africa, like in countries such as Libya, Tunisia, Egypt. No, thank you, sir. And perhaps this whole notion of a new strain of dictatorships, otherwise known as soft authoritarianism, rising in the world of today. Look at China and Russia. These are the nations that may be dictatorships, but more benevolent than most. After all, China, for instance, has lifted its 1.3 billion people out of poverty. The sweatshop workers' wages are rising. Ultimately, China has been using this developmental aid for more good than bad. And ultimately, this oppression of people doesn't come with and by the use of developmental aid. It's simply systematic of the Chinese autocracy system. So let's understand here why development nations would donate to these countries in the first place. First of all, it's a method of moral leverage. By giving you loans, by giving you aid, all these things allow for these developed nations to talk to these dictatorships. So thank you, sir. It allows them to talk to them, to negotiate with them, to perhaps influence domestic policy for the better. We also gave you good analysis of how you can't possibly use concrete to build anything other than a hospital. Ladies and gentlemen, we also put to you the second point, which is that it's inevitable help to the people. Developed nations aren't dumb. Clearly, by going through the IMF and learning through their mistakes in the Cold War, as their side would have us believe, clearly we are not going to give aid in a manner that's easily squanderable by the government. No government will be so dumb as to give them weapons as to massacre their own people. And also, we'd like to point out, they haven't dealt at all with my second speaker's substantive. First of all, on how it entrenches dictatorships in power. All the third speaker came up to tell us was that, China actually actively funds democracy. Quite the contrary. In fact, China's growing involvement in Africa, as evidenced by the first motion we debated it at all, kind of indicates that China's new mode is on Africa. China is looking to Africa and propping up these dictatorships while at the same time constructively engaging them, allowing them to use these funds to build infrastructure that not only helps China's business, but at the same time helps the African people. This is inevitable. And second of all, Darian also told you how this demeans the people. You think that people of Germany are proud to know they have gone through the two crises that shook the world and ultimately came out of it smiling, being the strongest economy in Europe right now. So second thing, under this point of contention, why would dictatorships therefore take out such loans in the first place? It seems quite counterintuitive why dictatorships want to help the people. But before I explain why, yes ma'am.
Unfortunately, we're not dealing with the dictatorships of today. We're dealing with countries which are democratic now and which were dictatorships in the past.
Ma'am, you need to understand that these dictatorships were dictatorships until the recent Arab Spring, that all these dictatorships remain constant and remain prevalent within our world of today, and we have to deal with them. So second here, under this first main point of contention, why would dictatorships take out such loans in the first place? First of all, they give us the simple result of personal wealth. And it's easy to overplay this point. But yet at the same time, it's also easy to get this personal wealth and loans back. For instance, for all the money that you might siphon off into your bank accounts, all we need to do, as provided by the third proposition, is to freeze the bank accounts, get the money back into the country's treasury. Second of all, we think they like the idea that they're keeping themselves in power. No, thank you, sir. But how do you keep yourselves in power? Is it simply a matter of having a military oppress them? Surely there must be some sort of a carrot as well as the stick. In this case, we believe the carrot is there in the form of infrastructure. It's in the dictatorship's self-invested interest for him to invest to a certain degree in infrastructure, because the state cannot operate without infrastructure. The state's people were more likely to revolutionize and rise up, assuming socio-economic conditions are more unequal than most. And therefore, there is an interest to invest in public infrastructure. Dictatorships, more often than not, are willing to invest in infrastructure for this exact reason of keeping themselves in power. And this is directly in line with their interest. We also gave you great analysis on how dictatorships necessarily squeeze the people less for money, given that overseas people are helping them here. No response from side proposition. Thank you, ma'am. We also talked to you about how institutions don't disappear. The best example being the Egyptian army. The Egyptian army is respected both by Mubarak and the Egyptian people, and they carry over. The Egyptian army is currently dictating the new constitution of Egypt. They, to a certain extent, they hold a responsibility of Egypt within their hands. After all, they were the very institutions that was keeping Mubarak in power in the first place. We don't think dictatorships are one-man jobs. They consist of factions, and given the ruling powers of these factions, they are so powerful that unlikely to disappear just because they're democratizing. So ladies and gentlemen, now we have dealt with why loans are taken out by dictatorships. Let's go on to my second main point of contention. How are such loans, therefore, going to be repaid? So first of all, we point to you the legal and moral obligations. We are amazed that our first speaker's substantive goes completely unrebutted by side proposition. So thank you, sir. We talked to you about how, they talked to us about how it's convenient for us recognize sovereignty just because it's convenient. Therefore, we will recognize the person in charge of the entire state of China. And yet, at the same time, this seems contradictory to the notion that China is a well-respected nation of today. Everyone clearly recognizes China's sovereignty. We are not just not invading Tibet. We are doing trade deals with China. Everyone is trading with China and signing FTAs with it. We don't think that such a point can stand when you say that we legally don't recognize them as countries. So well, after all, if China one day decides to democratize, will we then cancel it? We have not had a response from their side. Second of all, they point to us the moral obligation. Yes, but we point to you, morally you have benefited. Well, it sucks because you are under a dictatorship. But still, you cannot deny the fact that you have benefited from the person's altruism provided with infrastructure. And therefore, you do have a moral obligation to pay back this loan. We talked about debt restructuring. They tried to pick nitty-gritty details within our policy about inflation and so on and so on. I believe our second speaker has dealt with that sufficiently, talking about how inflation can be countered with hedge funds and debt restructuring. And last of all, their second speaker gives us the example of the substantive of how this alienates the people within the African nations, making them unlikely to transit into democracies. All we have to say to this point is simple. We believe that the first world nations have done themselves justice by giving themselves loans and aids to dictatorships in the first place, trying to improve, even while there's a dictatorship, the lives of these very people. They are altruistic, their debt ought to be repaid. Go inside for opposition.
Opposition evidently flawed. They could come out here today and scream in every speaker about the poor African citizens who are forced to repay the debts of their dictatorships and ignore the logic that we brought to them on two counts. The first count was a question of morality. Their logic: loans were used for bad things. We shouldn't make someone who didn't benefit from something pay for a loan. We countered this analysis with logic. We told you that first of all, extending that logic, they would cancel the debt of all incompetent governments. Their response to this was a misrepresentation of its argument by saying that no, dictatorships are in fact dictatorships are incompetent governments themselves. But precisely that point, right? We think that the logical extension of that logic is that any incompetent government shouldn't have to be responsible for the people. But this evidently isn't the case. Governments still can be responsible for the people, competent or not. But we had more arguments to this in my first speaker's substantive point. He told you that in fact people did benefit from loans. He told you about infrastructure, about developmental loans, which are plenty in the developing world. They had no response to this analysis. The second thing he said was, even if it was monetary loans which could have been used for anything, at least the dictator didn't squeeze this money out of the people. And this point really was never responded to by any last speaker on their side. So what we proved was that in fact their logic is flawed because these loans were used for good. Therefore, morally speaking, we can say that these people benefited from them. Therefore, therefore, it isn't a moral right for us to abolish these loans. But the second line of logic they had was loans were made by someone else. Therefore, you shouldn't pay for loans you didn't agree to make. We challenged them on this. Do they respect dictatorships as sovereign? And their response was no, but actually in the real world were forced to sometimes. Yeah, sure, but we think that firstly that's a tension that they have to resolve because they can't respect dictators as sovereign sometimes, but on other counts. But we also told you in my substantive point about why we need to respect dictatorships and new regimes as sovereign, and that was a point they also didn't respond to. The third line of logic they had was loans are crippling, therefore it's morally wrong to impose loans. We said, we have ways to reduce the impact of loans. In fact, we can postpone loans to such an extent that it doesn't actually hurt a citizen. They challenged us on various mechanisms and problems like inflation. We said, we have mechanisms to address this. And the only response they could think of to this was, well, that contradicts our principle. We told you that our principle is repaying people who lend it to you. We can repay them less, but repaying less is infinitely better than repaying none. And notice that their response to this point didn't actually counter our argument that in fact we have ways to ameliorate the harms of loans. So they considered this to us. Loans are not crippling. They considered all three lines of moral logic, and the question of morality falls to our side. The second question is one of dictatorships. What happens to dictatorships in the long run? They said they become alienated. Notice though that this point about alienation is entirely hung on their first speaker's substantive because all of the harms of alienation were derived from the notion that it's costly to have a loan. And we demonstrated that this cost can be ameliorated, therefore the substantive went out the window. But the second thing they said was, these dictatorships now have no incentive to turn into democracies. We destroyed this point by pointing out that there are a lot of incentives to turn into democracies, and their third speaker had no response, conceding his second speaker's very own substantive point. Then we told you in my substantive argument that we entrenched dictatorships because now countries like China have an incentive to keep them alive. And the only response they could think of was, the majority of Chinese developmental loans go to the developed world. Hang on a second. Developmental loans to the developed world? Not very likely. So for this reason, the vast amount of China's developmental loans in fact go to these developing countries which are dictatorships. They have every incentive to prop them up. But the last thing we said was what I mentioned earlier. My second point of substantive about how these dictatorships aren't respected, these new regimes critically aren't respected when they cancel their debt and act as the superior Western brother to this poor little regime. And their response to this was non-existent, their rebuttal from the line static. So what we demonstrated was that the question of morality falls to our side because their logic is hinged on questions of whether or not these loans were beneficial, but in fact, they were very beneficial to these individuals. Logic that was never rebutted. We told you that dictatorships are entrenched because it's a logical course of action for our country to entrench these regimes in order to get their loans back. Logic which was never addressed. And it's our logic, members of the House, which carries the day.
I guess we asked a very simple question. How is it morally acceptable by any human standard for us to make these people in newly democratic countries pay for their own repression, pay for their own oppression that they were subjected to, not by any fault of theirs? The only response they gave us was, oh, we need to ensure that the people in the first world get their money back. Really? We don't think there is any moral justification for what their policy does today. And I'll talk about this by addressing the three parties in today's debate. The first being the dictatorial regimes, the second being the newly democratic governments, and the third being the international community. So let's first talk about the dictatorial regimes, where they had, they seem to want to talk about today's dictators a lot. The problem is that in today's dictatorships, there are no newly democratic governments there, simply because they're dictatorships. So we do in fact think that the context of this debate is very predominantly in the dictatorships of the Cold War, because those are the governments which are now newly democratic, meaning that loans which were given then were often blank checks. And we explain why this was to you, because it was in the interest of America and Soviet Russia to ensure that stability was ensured in the country by allowing the dictator to repress its people in order to fight their own ideological battles. So what this means is that money was often used to oppress the people, like Rohan told you about the death squads in El Salvador. Secondly, that even if there was conditionality, they were often circumvented by the dictatorships, like I told you in my own substantive, and again they never responded to this. Thirdly, that they often use the money for their own interests, therefore showing that we both have a legal and moral obligation because we loaned it to them to ensure that these countries don't pay back. Furthermore, what did we talk to you about here? They said that, you know what, they are representative of the people, to which we say that they're not. And that's the reason why we're so quick to sanction Myanmar, because we recognize that as a dictatorship, they lack a certain sort of sovereignty. I brought this up in my rebuttals and they never dealt with it today. Lastly, they told us that they're going to squeeze people for their money, to which Brian gave you a very simple solution. Give aid to the people to ensure that they can, in fact, get the sort of money that they need, and they never really dealt with this today. Second group today, democratic governments, those that are newly democratic. And essentially what they need is lots of money for economic development, to build democratic infrastructures, as we see happening, for example, in Afghanistan. What happens when you have debt then is that money goes towards paying this debt, instead of ensuring that it can go towards the development of the country. And it doesn't matter if it's in the short term or the long term, because the fact is that at one point or another they're going to have to pay the money. It's going to affect investor confidence in the country. It's going to affect the economy. Again, they never responded on this. Furthermore, what you do by not cancelling that is you alienate them by making it clear that the international community doesn't see them as being any different from the last regime, and this means that you can't guide the democratic government towards truly respecting the needs of its people. Thirdly, today on the international community. Firstly, they told us about lenders, and they said, you know, we have to respect the fact that it's taxpayers' money, to which we say these very taxpayers are morally responsible because they loan money to dictatorial regimes to allow them to suppress the people in order to meet their own geopolitical interests, and therefore they don't deserve to have their money returned. Furthermore, they gave us the example of China propping up democratic regimes. And Ryan already told you, how is it logical that they're going to give more money in order to ensure that their money gets paid back? It's not something that's within their interest to do. But lastly, and also in the region, we think that other countries are going to have a decreased incentive to work towards democracy. Because what are these people always looking out for? Ryan and I characterize that it's not always a struggle for freedom, but it's a struggle for ensuring that you have food on your table. It's a bread and butter struggle, and when you don't get bread and you don't get butter from democracy, this means that the incentive to move towards democracy is hindered. And because cancelling debts better empowers the people, because it's the morally right thing to do, we would do it.
On behalf of the adjudicators here, thank you to both teams for giving us what was truly a very scintillating debate. This is not an easy topic to do by any means or any measure, and I appreciate the fact that within the 1 hour prep that you have had, you've given us a very exciting debate, which was very difficult to come to a decision to, and I think all of us were seriously thinking through all the issues that we've had. We've seen a fantastically high level of debate from both teams, and I'm sure that regardless of which team moves forward, all of you have fantastic debating careers to come as well. That said, it was a close round. It was a very close decision. It was not unanimous. It was a split decision of 2 judges to 1. And I'm just going to go through a few of the issues that we felt ought to be considered before we release the results. The first thing was that we loved the fact that there's a great deal of energy here and that everyone was truly engaged in this debate, no nonsense about it at all. Personally, I would have cautioned the teams again, perhaps given too many points of information. At times it did become a little bit of a distraction in the sense that some speakers had difficulty carrying on with that. So the eagerness is appreciated, but do keep it in check as well. But the other thing was that we were pleased in a sense that this was a debate where strategy did play a key issue. Because we were looking at almost 2 different descriptions of the world, as it were, being provided by both teams. One team felt very strongly that this is a debate that should take place within the context of brand new democracies, and as a result, we're talking primarily about the loans that we've had from the Cold War. We have another team that began to have a little bit more emphasis, looking at a slightly more futuristic perspective and what is the impact of this particular policy on the dictatorships that we have today and the democracies that we have going forward. So where the strategy comes in, when you have these sort of 2 very divergent views, is which team essentially was able to stamp its authority on the debate and say, well, this is the particular world viewpoint that carries the day, and which particular perspective tends to linger throughout the round as well. The second ability of the teams to progress is marked by the ability not just to stay within the particular comfort zone of our viewpoint, but being able to just take it a little bit more. We felt both teams really could have engaged each other more on the other side as well, but one team we felt just did a little bit more in terms of engaging their opponents, on their viewpoint as well. In terms of the other area, this is when it comes down to the real meat of the debate and looking at how loans operate. Do they actually have a detrimental impact to the point where the interest rates are actually preventing further development? Or are we talking about loans which, regardless of whether there were conditions or not, generally have a positive impact because money is actually being sent in? And also an examination of how these loans would have been used within a particular country, the analysis of how the country is structured. Now, here we just felt that in the end, the argument just went to the team that had a larger impact, meaning that they were able to just explain the concepts a little bit better, were a little bit less flippant within the argumentation. At times, some arguments felt almost as if they were coming out in a series of lists rather than a fully developed argumentation going from A to B to C and showing this is how the linkages are actually working. So which team was actually able to use the examples that they were using and provide a better analysis here. And finally, when you have a fairly new motion like this, where it is a fairly complicated and complex debate, it's very important to know what your stances here are as well. The debate, went into a lot of different areas. Sovereignty, we're talking about economic policy, we're talking about international relations as well. And on the whole, we felt that whenever the debate went into a new area, one team was a little bit more prepared and had the initiative, whereas sometimes one particular team appeared almost as if they were caught off guard and said, well, this is not something we've thought about before, and as a result didn't appear as consistent on some of these stances, and as a result this could have cost them dearly in the end as well. So those were the comments by the adjudicators. Do ask us for more detailed analysis later on as well. In terms of the best speaker for today's debate, we felt that it was the second speaker for the opposition. 2-1 decision, the team that will be advancing to the final is Hwa Chong Institution.